Hi everyone, I'm William Seymour and this is the video presentation for our paper at CHI 2023, Legal Obligation and Ethical Best Practice Towards Meaningful Verbal Consent for Voice Assistants. We're all familiar with the consent pop-ups that appear all over the web, and the permissions dialogues you have to go through to use a new mobile app. While annoying, they exist to satisfy legal requirements around data use, but what do you do when your device primarily uses voice? Our research set out to look for an elegant and effective way of gathering consent for speech-driven devices. A wealth of prior work in the literature addresses issues of consent in HCI, drawing from a range of areas including feminist theory and sexual consent. These accounts highlight a contrast between the more contractual framing offered and encountered online, where the consent process is a transfer of power from an individual to an organisation, with social understandings where seeking and giving consent is a process of negotiating boundaries and of respect. Distilled down to 5 key elements, consent must be voluntary, informed, revertible, specific, and unburdensome. When we compare this to the language used in the GDPR, we see that each of these concepts are represented to varying extents. Against this backdrop, voice assistants pose a unique challenge when managing permissions and consent for data collection, as the mechanisms normally used on the web and in mobile apps rely on graphical interfaces that directly oppose the hands-free nature of voice assistants like Alexa, Siri, and the Google Assistant. Despite this, whenever the user wants to use an Alexa app, also called a skill, they're directed to the companion app on their smartphone, where they have to navigate through the same toggle switches and checkboxes that we've been putting up with on the web for decades. There just isn't a mainstream consent flow for voice. Until now. Last year, Amazon introduced the voice forward consent feature to Alexa, which allows users to grant permissions verbally without having to resort to using a companion app. Moving consent into the conversation has several benefits, making the process easier and more accessible. But as researchers who spend a lot of time thinking about informed consent on a daily basis, the implementation of voice-forward consent has some significant problems. To give you a more concrete example of what this looks like in practice, here's a sample transcript from the developer documentation. You can see how this is a pretty usable conversation flow and integrates nicely into the flow of the skill. But under the surface, there are some key issues that show how this kind of verbal permissions process, at least as it's currently imagined and implemented, goes against some of the key principles of consent. For instance, when the user is asked to give consent here, there's a subtle shift as the skill transitions between talking as the third-party skill and as the Amazon-controlled Alexa OS. But if you're listening to this, there's no audible difference. Yet every major operating system takes this kind of differentiation for security and privacy prompts very seriously. We outlined this and 3 other problems in our provocation paper at CUI last year, describing the effects of the fixed 8-second timeout before Alexa reprompts the user, the very limited amount of information that people are given to make decisions on, and the lack of voice commands to revoke consent. In order to explore these and other problems, we conducted a Delphi study with experts from industry, academia, and the regulatory and policy sector. Our goal was to identify potential requirements for verbal consent in voice assistants and similar devices, to see where our expert panel agreed and also disagreed on these requirements, and finally to identify recommendations for voice assistants based on the discussions between our participants. The study assumes that the GDPR or equivalent legislation applies, and while I might use specific voice assistants as examples in this presentation, the study and results are platform agnostic and apply across voice assistants with third-party content. Following common practice, we curated our list of requirements in advance from data protection legislation, HCI and Ubicomp research on issues around consent and privacy notices, as well as research ethics guidance on informed consent. This resulted in 41 candidate requirements, each formulated as a modal statement. Participation took place anonymously, with experts asked to rate each statement for relevance to the consent process, actionability by platforms, and usability by end users. They were shown each other's responses between rounds and encouraged to discuss their reasoning before re-rating. The first 2 rounds followed a survey format, with the final round taking place over email in order to go deeper into specific topics that arose during the discussion. Between rounds, we calculated the average approval of each statement using the median, and the disagreement between experts using the interquartile range of their ratings. Here are some examples of the statements used in the Delphi study. You'll notice, for instance, that the first two here are taken from Article 13 of the GDPR. For the full list of 41, please check the paper. After the first round, there were 7 statements that had average ratings of 4.5 or more and an interquartile range at or under 2, showing low disagreement. As you can see, most of these statements are not controversial, and indeed some of them, such as requiring privacy policies, are already implemented by major platforms. Importantly, if we go back to the key criteria for informed consent, we can also see how they map to the assertions that informed consent should be voluntary, informed, revertible, and unburdensome. A key question that came out of the first round was around the role that consent was playing in interactions. On the one hand, if consent was the legal basis used for data collection, then many of the statements in the study, especially those derived from legislation, would be mandatory. On the other hand, delivering that much information verbally is completely infeasible. At the same time, the use of other legal justifications would mean that talking about data sharing as a consent decision would be misleading, as controllers would be able to collect data anyway if users declined to give consent. This led to the conclusion that while consent would often be appropriate as a legal basis in many of these situations, verbal consent dialogues would need to be backed up by a written privacy policy. This would allow for the convenience of gathering consent verbally whilst maintaining legal compliance. To this end, we make 2 recommendations: that platforms should distinguish between data collected under different legal bases, and relatedly, that they make it clear upfront when data sharing is a precondition of using an app or a service. If the only decision to be made is take it or leave it, then it may simply be better to inform the user that the skilled uses their data without mischaracterizing this as a meaningful consent decision. There was a lively discussion between participants around potential opportunities created using speech as the medium for consent. While some of our statements derived from the literature describe the possibility of renewing consent at regular intervals, or opening what would normally be a binary choice up into one with more nuance, there was a consensus that minimizing the number of consent decisions that people had to make was more important. To this end, one statement proposed letting users set general rules that could be applied in lieu of specific consent decisions. And this approach was supported, but participants pointed out that, as written, it's incompatible with the specificity requirements set out in the GDPR. We therefore recommend that users should be allowed to specify general rules or norms to third-party systems that can then make specific consent decisions on their behalf. Finally, we focus also on changes to platforms around interface symmetry and policy enforcement. Following on from the statements earlier, we strongly recommend that platforms introduce voice commands that facilitate the withdrawal of consent, in order to ensure that the process is intuitive and that it's as easy to give consent as it is to withdraw it. We also want to take this opportunity to reconsider the distribution of roles and responsibilities in voice assistant ecosystems. At present, developers are held liable for personal data use, even though platforms prescribe the mechanisms through which they seek consent and also how they use that data. At the same time, little support is given to developers around how they should communicate consent decisions to users and how they should reflect this in their privacy policies. This approach benefits platforms at the expense of users and developers. To conclude, our Delphi study of subject experts on verbal consent for voice assistants highlighted areas of agreement and disagreement around the way that consent interacts with platforms, skills, and data protection regulation. We considered the discussions of our expert participants around the tensions between consent as a legal obligation and as an ethical best practice, the potential to reduce the number of consent decisions that people have to make, and how this reflects a broader imbalance in how responsibility and control is allocated across the ecosystem. We set out a number of recommendations that we believe will better align voice assistants with the needs of users and developers around verbal consent. Thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to reach out to me at the conference or via email if you have any questions.